In today's episode, I'm going to share with you 3 riveting eyewitness accounts from the Albert Rizalda series, all centered in and around the Pacific Northwest. And folks, I gotta be honest here, after this episode, you'll understand why I'm never camping in the PNW again. You won't want to miss this one. On June 29th, 2005, Stu and his girlfriend Kristen were headed up to Timothy Lake, which is located near Mount Hood in Oregon. The plan was simple, a quiet weekend getaway, just the two of them. But here's the thing, nothing about this trip ended up being restful. In fact, by the time they packed up and left, everything about the world seemed different. Now, Timothy Lake had always been a peaceful escape for Stu, and he'd been coming here since he was a kid, hiking, fishing, swimming. The place was full of memories for him, and he was excited to show Kristen around. But for her, this was all brand new, and maybe that's why she was the first to notice the stillness. And as they drove up those winding mountain roads, the evergreens just seemed to go on forever. You know, tall, dark, and looming, like they were keeping watch over something. And the sun would cut through the branches in patches, and every now and then you'd catch a glimpse of the lake down below. And Kristen just sat there quiet, staring out the window. Stu, on the other hand, couldn't stop talking. He pointed to a spot on the far side of the lake, and there was a dock jutting out into the water. And he said that's the best place to fish. Told her he was planning to take her there tomorrow for a hike. But even with the sun shining down, something about the lake felt off. In fact, the whole campground was nearly empty. Just a few tents and RVs here and there. And Kristen noticed it, but she didn't say a word. Not yet. They pulled into their site and got right to work. They pitched the tent under this massive Douglas fir that just seemed to kind of tower over everything. Stu went off to gather some firewood, while Kristen set up chairs and cooking gear. And before long, they had a crackling fire, roasting hot dogs like it was any other camping trip. The sun at this point was starting to dip, and they both kind of hoped that once night fell, maybe things would feel normal. Or not. After dinner, they decided to slip into their swimsuits and head down to the lake. The water was cold, but you know how it feels when it's been a hot day, and the first hit of cold water is refreshing. So they waded out about waist deep, laughing and bracing, trying to enjoy the moment. But even as they were soaking up the peace around them, no pun intended, there was this weird silence hanging in the air. And it was so heavy, like something was about to happen. Still, they stayed in the water a little longer, floating, staring up at the sky as it shifted into these fading pinks and oranges, the colors bouncing off the lake's surface. But folks, Stu could sense something was off. The air felt heavier than before, like it was pressing down on him. And that breeze had completely gone. Everything had stopped. And for some reason, beyond reasons Stu could explain, his gut feeling told him to look up. So he did. And there, just across the horizon, he saw something. It was dark, moving against the last bit of light. A blurry shape. It didn't seem like anything to get worked up over, probably just a plane or something. But it stuck with him. That feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified. And they stayed in the water a little while longer, just floating there under the darkening sky. But that feeling, that weight in the air, it wouldn't go away. If anything, it was getting worse. Eventually, they climbed out, drying off by the fire, and as the night settled in, they snuggled into their camp chairs, just staring into the fire in silence. Normally, this would be the part where you'd feel at peace, you know? The stars coming out, the fire crackling. But not tonight. Tonight, the quiet didn't feel right. It wasn't peaceful. And Stu could feel it even more than ever. The stillness surrounding him was unnatural, like the whole world had pressed pause. And so once again, Stu glanced up, his eyes scanning the horizon, trying to shake this feeling, and that's when he saw something else. 2 lights this time, just hanging in the sky right over Mount Hood. They didn't belong there. His chest tightened, and he nudged Kristen and is like, look. And following his gaze, she's looking too, and she's like, what is that? Stu didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just the quiet of the lake, that something was happening. And so his gaze drifted back up to the sky, and he saw something else this time. Kristen explained that maybe they're just fires, but even as she said that, her voice sounded unsure. But Stu knew that fires don't float like that, and why were they just hanging there? He stood up, grabbing his flashlight, and explained, let's get a closer look. Kristen followed with their dog, Makayo, paddling along beside them as they made their way toward the outhouse. And with every step, the lights seemed to shift, like they were moving, or worse, watching. By the time they reached the clearing by the outhouse, the mountain came into full view. And now there were 3 of them. The lights had shifted, forming a perfect triangle, wide at the base and narrowing as it climbed. They weren't campfires. Whatever this was, Stu had never seen anything like it. He and Kristen stood there just staring, asking, what is that? The longer this went on, Stu's pulse began to race. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. Now they found a spot on the rocks and sat down, trying to make sense of it. The lights just hovered there like they were waiting for something. And then, the bottom left light dimmed and it was flickering. And slowly it moved toward the bottom right, and the 2 lights briefly merged, glowing brighter for a second before the left one slid back into place. Stu blinked. Lights weren't supposed to move like that. Without thinking, he pulled out his flashlight. It was a crazy idea, but something inside him needed to know, needed to see if the lights would react. He clicked the flashlight 5 times, sending a beam toward the hovering triangle. And for a second, nothing happened, just the stillness of the night. But then, the bottom right light blinked back 5 flashes, matching his exactly. Kristen just gasped, grabbing his arm, and she kept saying, oh my God, it's responding. Stu's heart was nearly pounding out of his body because this wasn't just some lights in the distance. Whatever this was, it knew they were there. It knew they were watching. And then he looked down at the lake, and that's when they saw something that defied explanation. The reflection of the lights on the water. Well, it wasn't a reflection. The lights had formed something, a shape, a doorway. And Kristen just kept saying, oh my God. Her eyes would widen. It's a doorway. Before they could say another word, something dark shifted in the reflection. It was a figure. And Stu's breath would catch in his throat as it moved closer, its form becoming clearer with each step. It wasn't just the lights. Something was coming through. Stu could feel his heart pounding, his hands shaking as he clung to Kristen, his voice barely audible as he just kept exclaiming, and it felt like every part of him was being drawn toward the light, like something was calling to him, pulling him in. The doorway shimmered, and then, as they watched, a dark figure emerged from it. It was like a shadow, but something ancient, something they couldn't understand, and Stu's breath hitched. Whatever it was coming for them. Without even realizing it, Stu and Kristen found themselves moving toward the water's edge, their feet carrying them without thought. And the figure in the doorway seemed to beckon them closer, its form growing clearer with each step, yet still impossible to fully grasp. Stu reached for Kristen's hand, squeezing it tight as they stepped into the cool, dark water. And the moment their feet touched the surface, this strange, tingling sensation rushed through them, spreading from their toes up to their entire body. It wasn't unpleasant. If anything, it felt magnetic, like the water itself was pulling them in. And they waded deeper, the water rising to their waists, but their eyes never left the figure. It was right there, just beyond their reach, and yet it still felt distant, like it was just out of their grasp. They looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding that whatever was about to happen, it was going to alter them forever. As they moved closer to the doorway, the figure became clearer, but not in a way that made sense. It shimmered, shifted like it was made of some light that danced across the mountain. And then it raised its hand. Without hesitation, they reached out. Their fingers brushed against something cold and alive. In that instant, everything changed. A blinding light swallowed them whole, pulling them forward like they were being yanked through space and time itself. The sensation was overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. They clung to each other, weightless as they hurled through the light, and when the light finally faded, they weren't at Timothy Lake anymore. They weren't anywhere they recognized. They stood in a vast, cavernous space, the walls kind of glowing softly, just pulsating with light, and Stu couldn't tell if the walls were made of crystal or light or something else. It didn't matter. They shouldn't be here. This place wasn't meant for them. His mind kept racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing fit. None of this made sense. The figure stood before them now, more defined, more solid. They didn't speak, but Stu could feel it inside his mind, filling him with knowledge, with understanding that didn't belong to him. Kristen gasped beside him, clutching his arm, trying to hold on to something real. Stu didn't know what this being was or where they were, but one thing was clear. It had chosen them for what he couldn't say, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Whatever this was, it was far beyond anything he could understand. The next thing they knew, they were back at the shore, standing knee-deep in the lake. The first light of dawn was now breaking over the horizon, but everything felt different. The lake, the trees, even the air, it was changed. They weren't the same people who had waded into the water hours earlier. And Stu looked at Kristen in her eyes, and he saw the same unspoken truth, that whatever had happened, it was real, and nothing would ever be the same again. Now, it's believed that the beings Stu and Kristen encountered this evening were Lemurians, which is an ancient alien race said to dwell deep under Mount Shasta, and during the research for this episode, Mount Hood as well. The stories in today's episode come to us from Albert Rosales' Humanoid Encounter database, which is a massive collection of accounts with strange beings and experiences no one can seem to understand. Unfortunately, the identity of the lights, the beings, and everything else that occurred this evening will remain a mystery. In 2003, in Duvall, Washington, Frank lived out on a beautiful piece of property that sprawled for miles. He'd been living there for over a decade, and he knew every inch of his land like the back of his hand. But lately, the land itself was beginning to feel different. And Frank was a bit of a loner, but he found solace in the company of his 3 loyal German Shepherds. They were his constant companions, always ready for a trek through the dense woods that bordered his property. However, Frank had recently noticed strange sounds coming from the wood surrounding his property. At night, sitting on the porch, Frank would hear it. This awful scream. Not like an animal in pain, but deeper, guttural, and far off, yet somehow too close. The hairs on his neck would stand up every time, and even the dogs, normally fearless, would tuck their tails and whine. Frank prided himself on knowing every inch of his land, like I said, but these sounds didn't fit. This was something that made even his dogs uneasy, and that was what really got under his skin. Well, in the coming days, when Frank was walking around his property, he was overcome by this feeling that something was watching him. Not out in the open, but tucked away in the dense foliage where anything could be hiding, waiting, and watching. His dogs would whimper at the trees, staring into the thick brush like they knew something was there, just waiting for the right moment. And as you can imagine, this made him incredibly nervous. But he had to continue living his life as normal as he could, and nothing too ominous had taken place. Yet. Fast forward to a few mornings later, it's around 7 in the morning. Frank's already up with his cup of coffee because he likes to enjoy his morning, and he's out walking the perimeter with his dogs. And he comes to one of the corners of his field, and his dogs start running ahead of him to what he can make out is a rather large indent in the ground. By indent, I mean tracks. His dogs are sniffing away, and he gets closer and realizes these indents are the largest human-looking tracks he's ever seen in his life. The tracks were huge, too big to be human, but that's what they looked like. His dogs, normally fearless, wouldn't stop whining, looking toward the trees like they were ready to bolt. Frank wasn't about to wait around to see what made those tracks. He whistled for the dogs and headed straight back to the house, his mind racing and racing. He had no idea what made the tracks or if they were somehow connected to the sounds he had heard that night. Frank had always trusted his dogs. I mean, they were his eyes and ears out here, but lately, their anxiety had started rubbing off on him. If they were scared, maybe he should be too. However, he was about to get answers to his questions real soon. Well, a few more days roll by, and it's around mid-afternoon, and Frank is cleaning up around the outside of his property. His dogs seemed very unsettled, and they kept sniffing around the woodline about 100 yards away from his current location. They would whine and look off in the direction like there was something really wrong. Frank knew his dogs and realized this isn't normal behavior. They were trying to tell him something. At first, Frank figured maybe the dogs were just spooked by a deer or some other critter, but they wouldn't let up. They kept whining and sniffing around the woodline like they were onto something. Frank knew his dogs, and if they were worked up, something wasn't right, and he started to listen. This is when the dogs took off, disappearing into the dense trees, their usual obedience forgotten in whatever had drawn them deeper. And so he hesitated for a moment, his gut telling him not to follow, but then a sharp whine echoed from up ahead, and it was one of the dogs calling back to him, almost as if it was urging him. So he sighed, he stepped forward, and realized something immediately. Everything around him felt oppressive, more than it had ever been. And the air was somehow colder, and the wind carried a smell he didn't recognize. He followed it, and the smell grew stronger, and soon he realized what that smell was. It was decay. Even though his stomach was turning, he kept going, following the distant sounds of his dogs, and the deeper he went, the harder it was to convince himself that everything was fine. They were just ahead, somewhere out of sight, but the further Frank went, the worse the smell became. And now, it clung to the air, heavy and sour like something had been dead for days. Frank's breath quickened as he pushed through the brush, wiping sweat from his brow and trying to calm his anxiety, which seemed to be robbing the very peace from his innermost self. And then, the feeling returned. The same one as before, that something was watching him, calculating his movements close by. And step by step, the feeling grew, and he felt as if the very forest was holding its breath. The dogs whining in the distance snapped him back to attention, but they sounded anxious, and with a strained voice, he called out to them, but they didn't come back. They were focused on something up ahead that he could not see. Now ahead of him was a thick patch of bushes he needed to get through to get to them. The smell now was so overpowering, his stomach began to twist and turn, filling his nostrils with a sickly, sweet rot. And now, Frank could make out a clearing just beyond the last stretch of foliage. Through gaps in the trees, Frank caught a glimpse of something. A patch of dark hair, maybe? He blinked, but it was gone. He had to keep going. The dogs were there too, but barely visible through the undergrowth. Something was very wrong, and he could feel it. Every instinct in Frank's body screamed at him to turn, but he couldn't. He could hear his heart in his ears now. The smell, it was so overwhelming. He pushed through the last line of trees, and then he saw it. At first, he had a hard time making sense of what he was seeing, because in the middle of the clearing was something he didn't understand. In that moment, the wind shifted and the smell hit him with full force. It was so thick and rotten he could taste it. His dogs were safe at least, but they were circling the center of the clearing, growling and whimpering, noses low to the ground, ears flat against their heads. and never taking their eyes off of it. Frank took a step closer. This wasn't brush or a pile of leaves, it was much larger. And after realizing what it was, dread crept over him so hard it was like a heavy weight on his chest. And he could see now that whatever this wasn't a bear or any animal he'd come to know, because it had arms, legs, a body, but lying face up in the dirt. And while it was absolutely massive, it wasn't human, that's for sure. Frank's knees felt weak and his hands trembled at his sides, forcing himself to step closer. His dogs had backed off now, recognizing that he had finally seen what they had sensed and smelt this whole time. There, in the center of the clearing, was the source of the smell. It was a body, covered in thick matted hair, with twisted limbs awkwardly lying perfectly still. It looked like something out of a nightmare, far too big to be real. Frank stepped closer, and his eyes scanned this massive form. But it wasn't the size of its body that disturbed him, it was the hands. They were 3 times the size of his own, fingers long and unnaturally thin, tipped with black, claw-like nails. Now, the sheer scale of them, those hands, was almost too much to process. It made the thing seem even more alien, more dangerous. Frank couldn't help but imagine what kind of strength those hands must have held when this animal was alive. And so he stood there frozen, staring at this lifeless form, and whatever it was, it didn't belong here. And he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to stay here for long, and as a matter of fact, he now felt like he was in imminent danger. If he didn't get out of there quickly, something bad was about to happen. Whistling for his dogs, Frank barely kept himself from running as they retreated from the woods, his mind still spinning over what he'd seen, and whatever that animal was, it clearly wasn't normal. His chest was tight, his hands were shaking, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him from deep within the trees. Coming out of the woodline, he needed answers. He needed someone to tell him that what he saw wasn't real, or worse, that it was. Busting through his front door, he slammed it shut behind him, immediately locking all the doors and windows. His hands fumbled with the locks as he twisted them shut, glancing outside, half expecting to see something lurking in the distance. The phone. He had to call someone. His breath came in shallow gasps as he raced to the phone, hands trembling as he dialed the local police. And when the dispatcher picked up, Frank could hardly get the words out. He stuttered, his breath catching in his throat, but somehow he managed to relay the basics. A body out there in the woods, but every time he tried to explain what it was, what he thought it was, his words just tangled up in his mouth. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. The words felt ridiculous even as they left his lips, like he was describing a nightmare, but he knew this wasn't a dream. The dispatcher pressed him for more details, and her tone was very sharp and disbelieving, but Frank could only keep repeating himself. He was losing grip on his own sense of reality, and he could hear the doubt in her voice. But after a pause, she told him just to stay put. They'd send someone out. The phone clicked. Frank dropped it onto the counter and slumped into a chair, his dogs huddling around him. And he kept his eyes on the window, just waiting for lights of a police cruiser, for someone to come and confirm that he wasn't losing his mind. But nothing came. Minutes passed, then an hour. Frank's eyes flicked back and forth from window to the woods, but it was like time had stopped, and for a while, it was as if his entire property was still. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The forest around him didn't make a sound. The fact that no police had shown up yet was very telling that something unusual was going on. He stood up, pacing the room, his heart hammering. Where were the police? Why hadn't anyone shown up? Then, suddenly, a distant sound broke the stillness. And it was a sound he'd recognized, but didn't make sense given the situation. It was the sound of a helicopter. His stomach dropped, and he rushed to the window, pushing the curtains aside just in time to see a large black twin-rotor helicopter descending near the woodline. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for something like that to be here. He wondered as he saw it descend, kicking up dirt and leaves in its wake. And then, men, dressed in black, poured out of the chopper like they'd been waiting for this moment. At that moment, he froze, unsure what to do. I mean, should he go out there? Should he talk to them? Should he hide? His legs just felt rooted to the floor. These weren't police officers, he knew that much, but their movements were too swift and precise. Some of them marched toward the woods while others turned and headed straight for his house. He could barely breathe. And there it is, knocking. Firm and demanding, he felt his pulse race and slowly opened the door to find two men in black uniforms, their faces obscured by glasses, standing stone-faced on his porch. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't offer any explanations. They stood there with demanding presence and told him to stay inside. Do not come out, do not ask questions. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but ask what was going on, but the look on their faces stopped him cold. There was something dangerous about these men. They didn't care about what he had seen or about what had happened. They didn't seem interested in explanations or giving answers. One of them stepped closer and his eyes hardened. Stay in your house. If you step outside, there will be consequences. All Frank could do was swallow hard, and he watched as the men turned away from him, and out of the corner of his eye, he could see movement in the distance. The other men had returned from the woods, carrying something between them. It was the body, and they laid it out on a massive black tarp that they had spread across the ground. They worked quickly, efficiently, as if they had done this 100 times before. No hesitation, no questions, just action. Frank's stomach churned as he watched them roll the lifeless form onto the tarp, folding up with swift, practiced movements. His dogs whined at his feet, sensing the same danger that had overwhelmed Frank by this point. The men near the chopper worked in silence, their backs to Frank. They didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if he didn't exist. The men who had spoken to him remained at his door, their cold eyes never leaving his face. They didn't have to look behind them to know when the body had been loaded up. It was as if they could feel it, and without a word, they turned away, stepping off his porch and heading back to the chopper. And Frank just stood there. The chopper's rotor spun to life again, stirring up a whirlwind of leaves and dust. And just like that, the men in black lifted off into the sky, taking the body and any answers Frank might have hoped for along with them. Now, this account follows very similar patterns to other cases where eyewitnesses had reported a dead animal or something they deemed supernatural occurring on their property. They'd call the police, men in black show up, threaten them, and then take the body. Gone. It's very strange, but makes you wonder if there truly is a military or government entity that is seizing these bodies and keeping them away from the public. Unfortunately, exactly what the strange animal carcass Frank and his dogs discovered that day on his property will remain unknown. On the night of February 10th, 2005, around 11:40 p.m., Kara was driving home that night, and the sky above Renton clear but cold, and the clock pushing close to midnight. It had been a long day at work, and she was ready to get home, kick off her shoes, and relax. The road was mostly empty, and the soft hum of her car engine the only sound breaking the stillness. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another quiet drive home, but guys, we know how these stories, they never turn out ordinary. And as she approached the small hill about 1/8 of a mile west of Southeast 176th and 151st, a dark sports car zoomed past her, its engine roaring as it flew ahead. And its two vertical headlights cut through the night the loud rumble of the car kind of just faded into the distance as it disappeared. Kara didn't think much of it, probably just some guy in a hurry. Or was it that he was fleeing from something? But when she crested the hill herself, something strange came into view. At first, it didn't register. She blinked. Her eyes were playing tricks on her. And there, hovering just above a grove of trees at the southeast corner of the intersection, was a ring of lights, red and blue, flashing in sequence from left to right. The pattern was mesmerizing, and the lights were unlike anything she'd ever seen. They formed a perfect circle, the object itself spanning what had to be 75, maybe 100 feet across. Now, curious, Kara slowed down, her car rolling forward as she kept her eyes locked on this strange object. And she's thinking to herself, what in the world? Craning her neck to get a better look, and she couldn't accept that this was a UFO, because you wouldn't normally see something like this on just a regular drive home. The lights continue flashing in perfect rhythm, hovering there. And for the next 30 seconds, Kara drove slowly, just trying to keep her focus on this while steering. When she reached the intersection, she turned left onto 151st, and in this moment, she let herself breathe. She thought, it's probably just some sort of drone trying to convince herself, I'm just really tired. But her curiosity gnawed her. Pulling into the parking lot of her apartment building, she parked her car and instinctively looked back toward the spot where she'd seen the lights, and it was gone. But then she looked and she saw something else. This time it was different, smaller, about 25 feet across, but it had the same red and blue lights. And it just hovered across the street, 100 to 150 feet off the ground and much closer than before. Instant anxiety. The only thing she thought was, if it moves, I'm out of here. And then just like that, it began to move. And Kara practically froze as she watched the object slowly descend, moving in a strange, almost hypnotic motion. It didn't drop straight down. Instead, it fell in a zigzagging, falling leaf pattern, dropping from around 150 feet to maybe 20 or 30 off the ground. The lights, those red and blue flashes, seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. And she felt as though her entire being was just locked. No matter how hard she tried, she was basically involuntarily doing her best statue impression, to put things lightly. It started moving toward her, drifting closer. Managing to somehow move, she fumbled with the car door, throwing it open and stumbling out, her eyes never leaving the object. She was so entranced by what she was seeing that the cold night air hit her skin and she barely felt it. And then something snapped her out of her daze. Her headlights were still on. Without thinking, she scrambled back into the car, her hands shaking as she turned them off, and the second she clicked the lights off, something strange happened. Suddenly, the entire car filled with a bright, blinding light. It was as if someone had dropped a spotlight directly on top of her. And the light was so intense, it felt like it was burning through her eyelids. And Kara shielded her eyes, just gasping for breath. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out, to run. And then nothing. The next thing she knew, she was no longer in her car, folks. In fact, she was standing in a room. No, not a room, a dome. The walls were smooth and white, almost glowing with no windows, no doors. The floor beneath her feet was the same color, white, just sleek and cold. Everything felt impossibly sterile, like the air itself was devoid of any warmth or any life. She realized she wasn't in Kansas anymore. Now, in front of her was a large white box. It was the size of a desk, and it was covered in zillions of tiny colored lights flashing against a dark field. Kara blinked, trying to process what she was seeing, and she felt calm. Strangely calm, but also utterly bewildered. She absently reached for the collar of her dress, unbuttoning it without really thinking about it, and then the next thing she knew, her dress was pulled at her feet. But it wasn't until she saw the figures that she felt the first stirrings of fear. Two beings stood in front of her, and they were smaller than she'd expected. Maybe 4'8", maybe 5 feet tall with thin, elongated bodies. Their skin was gray-white, smooth and cool, and their heads were shaped like light bulbs. Their eyes, huge, wide, and black, staring at her unblinking. The rest of their features were barely there. Tiny ridges for noses, thin slits for mouths, and small flapped holes where ears should have been. They wore tight metallic blue-gray uniforms, the material shimmering in the light of the room. And on the left side of their chests, each had a white circle with a triangle inside of it, like some kind of insignia. She didn't move, she couldn't. And these beings did not speak. They simply moved toward her, their long, thin fingers brushing her arms as they guided her to a table that seemed to appear out of nowhere behind her. It was a sleek white table perched on a single pedestal. Kara felt herself being gently lowered onto it, and still she wasn't scared, just confused. A third figure appeared, dressed in the same uniform but with a splash of color, like an orange-red stripe around the neckline. He held a silver, mallet-shaped object in his hand and, without a word, placed one end of it against his eyes and lowered the other end to her abdomen. The object was cold, and as he moved it around, pausing every so often, Kara wanted to ask what was happening. She wanted to know why she was here, why they were doing this. And then without her saying a word, they answered. But not through speech, but through her mind. And as clear as day, said, "You are progressing physically and mentally as planned and are very receptive to us. And we are pleased with what your father has taught you. But now, it's time for you to go." Telepathy. They were speaking to her without speaking. She blinked, confused. Go, but she didn't want to leave. She didn't even understand what was happening. Yet, still, these beings gently lifted her off the table, helped her dress, and as she buttoned her collar, one of them spoke again, the words just reverberating in her mind. And they explained to her, "You will see us again." And then, just as suddenly as it began, she was back in her car. Now, it's no secret that what happened that day to Kara is beyond comprehension and is easily one of the wildest things that can happen to anyone. The craft she witnessed, the beings that spoke to her, and what it meant to her life will go on to remain unknown. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to comment below PNW, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this format of storytelling where we dive into strange cases and stories of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Hit that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.